So 20 years ago, I'm riding my bike to the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, and I stopped and took a picture of that. What is that?
A freeway ramp to nowhere that you could totally Looney Tunes off the side of. Hiding in plain sight on the gigantic double-decker Markham Bridge that carries I-5 over the Willamette River. Thankfully, Oregon did a good job putting up barriers to keep people from driving on it. But far east of downtown, this country highway does something really weird.
So I'm riding the back seat, heading up to Mount Hood for the first time. When I hit about here, I go, what's the highway doing? It suddenly gets really wide.
Like the road is supposed to keep going straight, but it doesn't.
It's almost like you're up on a bridge, except there's no bridge.
And it turns out both of these oddities are related.
That over there and this over here are 13 miles apart from each other. It was all going to be part of the same highway that got canceled.
I would have found it pretty cool to have a freeway to zip across East Portland, but the 4,000 people living in the project's path found it pretty uncool.
Well, that's a lot of housing stock that's gone. Honestly, it's probably one of the most overtold freeway revolt stories on the internet, but I used to live here, and by golly, I want to walk around and show it to you now. This is the story of how Portland would have had a freeway right here, but they stole the money and built a train instead. So it's the end of World War II. Everybody's out buying brand new cars and buying brand new houses out in the suburbs. Downtowns are dying.
There was a pretty bad housing shortage, and so cities built a whole bunch of new starter homes out on the edge of town. And these families were ready to shop, so businesses chased them out to the suburbs.
And so planners and engineers think, oh, wow, how can we fix this? I know, we'll build freeways that head downtown. That way people who live out in the suburbs can get to downtown to work and to shop and spend money, and that'll slow down the decay of the downtown.
And had they known they were going to just end up ripping out half of the central business district for parking spaces, they probably wouldn't have done it. So many buildings gone. But congestion on city streets was a real problem in the 40s and 50s.
Cities are looking for stronger, beefier roads to move all of these new cars around. And here in Portland, that was the Banfield Freeway here. You know, back when I lived here 20 years ago, I thought for a depressed section of freeway that they dug out, why did they dig it so curvy and windy? And it turns out they didn't dig it out. It was a naturally occurring gulch.
Formed during the Ice Age, it had ponds and waterfalls.
In fact, it was a neighborhood called Sullivans Gulch. The railroad found it a century ago. They put the railroad tracks through there. And so when it came time for Oregon to build a freeway, they said, oh, perfect. We'll just take out that Sullivans Gulch neighborhood and put the superhighway through there.
And by 1957, the Banfield was the first of many freeways coming to the Portland region.
President Eisenhower signs a really big federal aid highway act that basically said for every $1 you spend building a new interstate highway, the feds will pay $9. It's basically a free interstate highway, and no region in the country could pass that up because it's such a sweet deal, including Portland. So they drew a map.
They hired a controversial New Yorker who had planned to crisscross America's biggest city with a bunch of highways.
Too many big buildings and too many people coming in and out. That was bad planning.
Portland hired him to plan their city after the war, and he wanted to slice it up like a pizza. These freeways got built. These didn't. As you drive north on the freeway through downtown,
there would have been a branch exiting the 405 heading north into the industrial area up here.
On the city's northwest side, a viaduct called Interstate 505, but they only built less than a mile.
And the freeway it sure sneaks up on you pretty quick.
This freeway would have connected to a state highway, so at least it had a purpose. The Rose City Freeway kind of had no purpose at all.
I'm not quite sure what the rationale was. Well, we already have 2 freeways cutting across town, so why not a third one?
The Rose City Freeway would have sliced through neighborhoods heading east of downtown, parallel to 2 other planned freeways.
The Fremont Bridge, the big arched one that's really pretty, you can drive on a teeny tiny section of the Rose City Freeway that just unceremoniously dumps you at a hospital.
Which shows at one point in time, Oregon was pretty serious about building this.
Traffic going westbound on the Rose City Freeway to southbound 5 would have merged in right here.
3 miles east of downtown, plans for a new north-south freeway, so drivers could bypass downtown Portland entirely.
So about 20 years ago, I got invited to dinner at a 90-year-old guy, Mr. James. He and his wife invited me to dinner. They used to live here. If they were still alive, they'd be in their 110s, I think. But he told me that back in the 1960s, they almost lost their house. All their neighbors almost lost their house. for that eastern bypass freeway. They called it the Laurelhurst Freeway.
The north-south loop that later became I-205. A technical study committee fed data into a computer for 4 years, and this is the route it spit out. Even though county leaders didn't want the freeway there. But it's kind of like what AI technology is to government officials today. You gotta trust it, it's from the computer. The county wanted the freeway farther to the east. And thankfully, that's eventually what panned out. But for the James family, this got awfully scary for a bit. And seeing how impacted people are actually real people, you can imagine the community's shock and awe when Oregon really dug their heels into building the first of one of these controversial freeways, and it impacted thousands.
Okay, so we have the Banfield Freeway to go east-west on, but it was sort of outdated from the moment it was opened, right?
It was built before interstate highway standards. Had only 2 lanes in each direction at the time, which would jam up pretty early in the morning, with really short on and off ramps, and no real shoulders for people to pull over if they break down. Federal engineers proposed Oregon build a new east-west freeway to carry traffic across Portland.
And to have the federal government basically pay for a brand new interstate highway quality 8-lane expressway across the city, well, how can you say no to that? So in 1965, city leaders started drawing some lines on maps, kind of picked out what they wanted, held a couple of meetings in 1969 to give people the illusion of decision-making. And ta-da! You had a route for the new freeway.
The goal would be to pull all the through traffic off the parallel east-west streets, make them less congested, have fewer cars at the crosswalks. But this freeway wasn't running on the periphery of the city. Once it took off east from the Markham Bridge and then ran diagonally through an industrial area, it would start cutting through some of Portland's densest neighborhoods of houses, wiping out somewhere between 1,300 and 1,700.
That doesn't sound too bad, right? Because it's not like it's 50,000 houses. But then you start counting them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You go, I'm going to have to count for a while. That's a lot of housing stock that's gone.
This video is not sponsored by Junior Works, the investing platform that securitizes millions of pieces of children's artwork so that you can own a piece of tomorrow's Banksy today. Oregon was planning a freeway that would gobble up an entire city block after block after block, along Division Street in Portland.
One spot here where the state of Oregon had started buying up houses and knocking them down.
In the years after the freeway was canceled,
The city of Portland ended up with the property and turned it into a little tiny park that they call Piccolo. I guess because it's small.
as Oregon started buying more houses, there started to be more community opposition. And it became a fight between those who bought brand new houses on the edge of town, who really wanted the freeway, against people who already had homes closer in.
And income shouldn't matter, but even in the 1970s, this was not exactly a blighted neighborhood. This was working class, middle class households, and so that added to the controversy.
After running parallel with Division Street for a while, around 50 blocks in, the freeway would dive south and started running parallel with Powell Boulevard. And by 1969, it was looking like a done deal, even if building it would be a rough road.
St. Mark's Lutheran Church bulldozing the whole thing to the ground and breaking the 11th commandment, which is something like, thou shalt not build a freeway on top of a Lutheran church. They made it very clear that God was not afraid to hire a lawyer.
The freeway would continue to run east, taking out another city block, running parallel with Powell. High-speed one-way frontage roads like you'd see in Texas, helping drivers casually slip from Powell Boulevard onto the freeway. And then, a big interchange at I-205.
You get out here to about 92nd Street, the freeway plows through this building, which Portland Public Schools weren't too excited about because it was one of their elementary schools.
The Barlow School sat right in the path of the new Stack interchange.
What I also don't know is, how did the Oregon Department of Transportation end up owning that building anyway?
This was the way freeways were built back in the 1960s and 70s. Almost zero public involvement, even for local officials like mayors. The project bending to the whims of sometimes just one bureaucrat or one powerful elected official, which history showed us time and time again usually turns out badly.
Back in the 1960s, you really only had to hold 2 meetings and then you could just build a freeway. But that changed when Richard Nixon signed into law the 1969 National Environmental Policy Act that said, look, Any project that's spending federal money, that's your taxpayer dollars, so you should get a say in how it gets spent, which means big projects like the Mount Hood Freeway would need a big public involvement process that Oregon hadn't done.
This new law empowered opponents, the ability to take the case downtown.
So the freeway project all ends up in front of a judge because opponents of the freeway argue, well, you didn't follow the public meeting rules. And Oregon said, oh yeah, we did. 1969, we held 2 meetings about that freeway, and that's all we were legally required to have to do back then. But the opponent said, yeah, but you kind of just told us where the freeway was going. You didn't actually, ask us where it was supposed to go. You picked a route from 1965 that you'd already made up your mind about without public meetings. And the judge heard all that and said, I think you're right. Throw it out.
The 90% match money from the federal government that had been a big gift in the 60s now came with a big responsibility. Oregon would now have to document all the impact the project would have on people and the environment. This really hadn't been done before. So Oregon hired an architectural firm, Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, the same firm that would later design the replacement One World Trade Center building in New York. And the firm wrote up a gigantic environmental impact statement for the new freeway, really the first of its kind. And thanks to Emily and Max of the State Library of Oregon, for the first time online, I have all 713 pages for you. And it reflects how public involvement helped Oregon reshape its focus a little bit.
And okay, you're losing a neighborhood, but Oregon now said it's no longer a freeway, it's a transportation corridor, and they envisioned putting these bus lanes down the middle of the freeway and big bus stations with high-density, tall housing next to those stations.
And these were no bench on the side of the freeway. Right next to the church, which now gets to stay, towering transit and retail, which, had they built it, would have catapulted Portland to be a leader in bus rapid transit instead of light rail. Transit would now be a component nearly as important as the freeway itself. But then the architectural firm, who Oregon paid to hire, took the study seriously and did a good job. Too good of a job.
Their traffic forecast, as they looked into the future, showed the Mount Hood Freeway might work too well at bringing cars across the city and dumping them onto the Markham Bridge here where it crosses the river.
Showing that by the year 1990, the line of cars waiting to get on the bridge would stretch back at least half a mile in the morning, which kind of defeats the entire point of building the freeway in the first place.
So they proposed building a new $100 million bridge,
effectively doubling the size of the Markham Bridge. And hey, the feds are paying for it, so, we could do a tunnel instead. It only costs 2.5 times as much.
And a little bit of foreshadowing, Portland did eventually build that bridge.
And this one doesn't allow cars on it at all. The Mount Hood Freeway was going to need a new bridge across the Willamette River. Decades later, that bridge has gotten built.
Except it's only for the Max Light rail system.
The Tillicum Crossing Bridge opened in 2015 for trains, buses, bikes, scooters, and people walking on foot. Pretty much everybody except cars. Perhaps the city's reaction to the Mount Hood Freeway.
Then the oil embargo of 73 hit, and the opponents had a new talking point. They could say, well, why are we bothering to build new central city freeways when it can't even buy gas?
When OPEC cut off the supply of oil to any country that had supported Israel during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the price of gas at the pump doubled pretty much overnight. But those pushing for the freeway still made a good case. Oregon drivers had been paying lots of federal gas tax. If we don't build this freeway, we have no chance of winning that money back.
Then the Nixon administration tried something that hadn't been done before. They said, okay, maybe you can divert some of this highway trust fund money to a transit project.
It's time you tried RTD's Park and Ride service.
The theory being if you spent the money on transit, more people would use that, which would make the roads flow better, which benefits drivers.
And that got opponents really excited because they could say, okay, yeah, this free money that we don't want to lose out on, we don't have to spend it on the Mount Hood Freeway. We could spend it on something else.
Before the 1950s, Portland had electric streetcars all over the place. With the possibility of a big pot of federal money to reach into, the governor put a team together to study, could the streetcars come back?
And I guess enough was enough. The Portland City Council then voted 4 votes to 1 to stop supporting the Mount Hood Freeway.
Joining in with Portland's mayor, who famously was a huge opponent. Supporters' last hope was the new governor, who had been a fan of the Mount Hood Freeway, but now decided that light rail was probably a better use of his time. It left proponents of the project with few friends, so they tried to go directly to the voters, an initiative to force the state to build the freeway. That went to court, and the judge ruled no initiative.
And with that, the Mount Hood Freeway was dead. No referendum vote. Although it would have been interesting to see if Portland would have supported the freeway or not. It kind of reminds me of the 1970s. Phoenix, Arizona had a vote on freeways, which I talk about in my documentary, Phoenix Without Freeways, where they voted no on freeways and then a decade or two later changed their minds, and they've since built a lot of freeways. I wonder if the two stories are similar but flipped. Could Portland have voted yes on the Mount Hood Freeway and then a couple of decades later changed its mind? Well, I guess for the sake of this neighborhood, it's good we never found out.
Opponents knew to truly kill the project, they needed to get Oregon to sell off all the land they'd already bought. And that was probably wise. Politicians and candidates, especially in those eastern suburbs like Gresham, kept trying to resurrect the Mount Hood Freeway. It kind of became a political issue in the mid-1980s, but never could build quite enough public support to do it.
Knowing the Portland that is versus the one that could be, it's kind of surreal to think if I stayed on this freeway, I'd end up at the Markham Bridge downtown. Okay, so I'm the road guy. Am I disappointed that they took the money from a freeway and used it to build a light rail system instead? Well, clearly no. That's why I'm telling you the story. When I lived in Portland, the first year I was here, I didn't even own a car. I used the Max all the time. I loved it. And it showed me also that there's more than one right way to build a good town.
And it wasn't just the Max Light rail system that got built out. Money from the canceled 505 and Mount Hood freeways went to projects all over the region, including adding a lane on the Banfield Freeway since it was now the only east-west route.
And if you think that poor little Sullivans Gulch neighborhood had a hard enough time with the Banfield Freeway, that blue Max Light rail line, that very first one, found its home sandwiched between the freight rail line and the freeway.
Portland's Max Light rail system is serving up more than 30 million rider trips per year. It's the lifeblood of the urban areas it serves. It accomplishes that old 1950s goal of getting suburbanites into the downtown. With a train, people arrive on foot, so you don't have to tear up the downtown for parking spaces. But as big as the MAX system is, it doesn't quite reach everybody and serve all of the suburban mobility needs. One idea was to connect that weird freeway grade south of Gresham, the one that just dumps the entire highway into town.
And at rush hour, it makes all the shopping and everything on this street kind of a mess.
Well, what if they connected that with a new expressway running north all the way up to Interstate 84? The Mount Hood Parkway, which is a very unfortunate name, found opposition from the very cities that had been big supporters of the Mount Hood Freeway. We all like to drive on the freeway, we just don't like the freeway driving over us. So here's another idea. McLaughlin Boulevard is kind of like a freeway as you head south out of downtown Portland. Take the ramp to the Milwaukee Expressway, and then start zipping east across town on something that's one of those unfinished 1960s freeways anyway. But once you get to I-205, the expressway ends. From there, it's just a two-lane country highway full of cars. So what if Oregon started building the freeway from here, extending it eastward?
It was called the Sunrise Corridor, and at the time, 15 years ago, they envisioned a big freeway system that would go from I-205 out to the town of Boring. That's not a joke. There is a boring Oregon. Even the sign is boring.
The boring city center with the boring post office. But at least it's not as boring as Estacada. But you want to know what turned out really boring? The Sunrise Corridor. They only built the first 2 miles.
It's not like an interstate highway, beefy freeway. And kind of disappointingly, it ends at a stoplight here and everybody has to wait to turn left. But, you know, it's nice. But in a lot of ways, this is the legacy of Portland.
The Mount Hood Freeway was probably one of the biggest freeway backfires in American history. No matter how good the final design for the Mount Hood Freeway may have been, there's no doubt it was the wrong place to build it. The project has appeared to have soured Oregonians so badly on freeways that even sensible suburban freeways that probably do need to get built will probably be shelved for many more decades. One more way that Portland became Portland. So you found yourself sitting through 19 minutes about an obscure 1970s Portland freeway? You probably want to hit subscribe. And you probably want to join me thanking the contributors, people like you, who kick in a couple of dollars a month at patreon.com/roadguyrob, who fund 2/3 of my production budget. Seriously, you're paying for it, not the YouTube ads.